Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 12 wide receiver rankings for the 2021 fantasy football season. On today's episode, of course, we're talking about all things related to the wide receiver position, beginning with matchups. We'll talk about which defenses are giving up the most points to opposing wide receivers thus far this season on average in a half PPR scoring format, in order to give ourselves some more insight as to who has the most advantageous matchups and how that is potentially going to affect the upside of a given player. After we talk about matchups, we'll transition to our top 36 wide receiver rankings, as I'll share with you guys my perspective and opinion and the statistics that justify my reasoning as to how I think the wide receiver position is going to stack up when it's all said and done by the end of week 12. Before we begin today's video, I want to thank you guys for continuing to support the channel. Again, I've been grinding the last couple days here, just trying to put out content before the Thursday slate of games. Again, we have 3 games tomorrow. Do not forget, tomorrow morning, 7:30 a.m. to 9:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, I will be live streaming here on the channel. For those of you who have not yet already, click the subscribe button, click that bell notification button. Anytime I'm live streaming, it'll notify you. So you'll go ahead, hop in here, check out the rankings that I'll have updated tomorrow morning if anything changes. Otherwise, this should settle you away for tomorrow's contest. Outside of that, do not forget, Kansas City Chiefs, Arizona Cardinals, they are on a bye week. So don't go ahead and play those players. Outside of that, check out Underdog Fantasy. For those of you who have not yet already checked them out, there's a variety of contests, whether it is the Thursday night games, of course, for the NFL, NBA, NHL. There's a variety of contests that you can join, play more fantasy sports, and of course, enjoy yourself throughout some of these contests that you may not have players competing in. Put some money on the line, and of course, take some money home, and that's the entire plan. For those of you who have yet to do so, if you sign up today using promo code Andrew, Underdog Fantasy is willing to match up to $100 of your first deposit, an extremely generous offer, so you can get ready for this upcoming week's contest, of course, the Thursday contest, and then Sunday Battle Royales, and much more with the pick'ems and the different, variety of things that they're beginning to add every single week. Check that out. Use promo code Andrew. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into this, shall we? Beginning with matchups at the wide receiver position. Again, we do this every single week to give you guys some more perspective as to who is really, truly the easiest matchup. As you can see, I've divulged the information via statistics, via targets, of course, receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns the wide receivers have scored against these defenses, in order to give ourselves an idea as to how many points these defenses are giving up to opposing wide receivers thus far this season on average in a half PPR scoring format. Of course, the teams that are at the top of this list have been in that conversation for the last couple of weeks. We've seen the Washington football team improve at times in the last couple of weeks, but all in all, we've seen the Washington football team, Miami Dolphins, Minnesota Vikings, of course, Tennessee Titans, Indianapolis Colts, Chicago Bears. These have been teams that have always been in that top side rotation. Whether or not they're giving up, a lot of points in one week or another, the averages across the season pretty much hold it against them. That yes, they are the worst matchups. And you can tell by the amount of touchdowns they've given up alone that they are some of the best matchups that you should be playing your respective wide receivers into. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, of course, we have the Buffalo Bills, who have only given up 3 receiving touchdowns to opposing wide receivers this season. That perhaps doesn't bode well for many of the receiving options of the New Orleans Saints this week, if in fact you were already anticipating playing them. But either way, just wanted to go ahead and present these statistics to you guys. You can go ahead and pick them apart as you'd like. I'll, of course, be referring back to these statistics as we progress through the video, and that's exactly what we're going to do at this moment in time as I go ahead and talk about my top 36 wide receiver rankings. Now that we've covered matchups, let's get into this. Do not forget, rankings are subject to change. By the time we get to Sunday, these rankings could by a wide margin change, because there are a lot of injuries that, of course, many of us are dealing with via our players that hopefully are going to get them on the healthy side this upcoming week, and hopefully we won't see these players be absentees in our overall lineups to help us win in week 12. All right, let's get into this. Our number 1 for this week is Cooper Kupp. Of course he is. Cooper Kupp has been the number 1 wide receiver in fantasy football for the last couple weeks in a row, and of course has just been dominating at the position. In terms of what he's been able to accomplish, of course, he's averaging 21.61 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. The stats that I went and I found earlier today was, in comparison to his 2019 season, which by far and away was his best season of his career. He finishes the number 4 overall wide receiver that season. He is about 7 receptions away and 20 receiving yards away from eclipsing those numbers back in 2019. Already, and we're only, what is it, week 12? That's only 11 games into his season, and we're already in a position in which Cooper Kupp is going to be eclipsing his best season ever. It just goes to show you just how incredible he's been, and of course, why he maintains as our number 1. Moving on. Davante Adams is our number 2, coming off an incredible week of 27 fantasy points, 2 receiving touchdowns, 115 receiving yards. Again, like I mentioned last week, playing against the Minnesota Vikings is a cakewalk for the Green Bay Packers, specifically, of course, Davante Adams. And typically when he's coming off of a bad performance, he turns it around and has himself an even better game. So he gets to play against the Los Angeles Rams. Of course, Jalen Ramsey is the topic in mind, and whether or not he's potentially going to be able to flourish and have himself another big performance here, that's to be, obviously questioned. Either way, number 1 wide receivers in the last couple weeks against the Los Angeles Rams have still found themselves a lot of success. Specifically, DK Metcalf, 98 yards, 2 touchdowns. Brandin Cooks, 83 yards and a singular touchdown. Deebo Samuel, 133 all-purpose yards and 2 total touchdowns. Wide receivers that are the number 1A, the primary spot of that respective offense, have succeeded against this defense in the last couple weeks, and I don't expect Davante Adams to slow down anytime soon. Moving on, we have our number 3 wide receiver, Justin Jefferson. Now, I was referring to his stats earlier today when I talked about Kirk Cousins. If you guys haven't checked out my quarterback rankings and you're wondering where you were going to go this week in terms of top 16, you can check that out. Outside of that, in terms of Justin Jefferson and what he's been able to do in the last 2 weeks, I mentioned it. Kubiak, their offensive coordinator, of course, son of Gary Kubiak, came out and said that, yes, we need to get the ball to Justin Jefferson more. This was about 2 to 3 weeks ago. In the last 2 weeks, Justin Jefferson has seen 21 targets that have led to 17 receptions, 312 receiving yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns. The amount of opportunity he's given, in comparison to the weeks in which he was only getting like 5 or 6 targets, it's a major upgrade. And of course, that's why he's flourished into becoming the Justin Jefferson that we know and love. Now, of course, when we look at the matchup against the 49ers, they're middle of the pack. I'm not too worried about it. All I look at when I think about Vikings players, because I did mention this regarding Dalvin Cook earlier this week, when these Vikings studs are given opportunity, it always leads to success. And that's all they were really in need of. Dalvin Cook needed more touches. He's had 27 and 25 touches each of the last 2 weeks. Justin Jefferson needed targets. He's had, 11 and 10 in the last 2 weeks. And of course, it's led to incredible success coming off a 33-point fantasy game. He's going to be fantastic this upcoming week. Moving on, Deebo Samuel on the other end of this matchup, of course, taking on the Minnesota Vikings, who are giving up the 3rd most points to opposing wide receivers this season. Of course, just this last week, Davante Adams, an incredible performance, along with Marquez Valdes-Scantling with a late, long touchdown that certainly secured that overall game into being a closer contest. Nonetheless, Deebo Samuel last week only had 2 targets, 1 reception for 15 yards. Yet he was still able to maintain his fantasy excellence as he put up 15.9 fantasy points. You may be wondering, Andrew, how in the heck did he actually do that? Well, if you're able to run the ball as consistently as Deebo Samuel's been able to over the last 2 weeks, you probably don't need to catch the ball anymore. Deebo Samuel last week had 8 rushing attempts for 79 rushing yards and 1 rushing touchdown. When he's averaging 10 yards per carry, of course they're going to continue to give him the ball. In the last 2 weeks alone, he's had 13 rushing attempts for 115 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns. He's just been unstoppable on the ground. And as long as that kind of opportunity continues to go in his direction, whether it is on the ground or through the air, Deebo Samuel's an unstoppable force in this offense that just continues to put up great points. Minnesota is going to be in trouble trying to bottle up Deebo Samuel, whether it is out wide or in the backfield. Moving on, we talk about our next wide receiver. We have number 5, Ja'Marr Chase, the thumbnail for today's video. Ja'Marr Chase is an incredible wide receiver. He's having an incredible rookie year. And though he only had 11.5 fantasy points last week, again, he maintains his security of being a 10-plus fantasy point play every single week. He's only once been below that number, and it was prior to their bye week. Now, going into this upcoming week's matchup, they take on the Pittsburgh Steelers. This last week, of course, Keenan Allen, an incredible performance of 112 yards on 9 catches. Mike Williams, 5 catches, 97 and a touchdown. And the last time that Ja'Marr Chase took on the Pittsburgh Steelers, that was back in week 3. And Ja'Marr Chase had himself a great game, 4 catches, 65 yards, and 2 touchdowns. So, of course, the Pittsburgh Steelers secondary, though they have been significantly better in the past, they can definitely be exposed. And we've seen that via Ja'Marr Chase and recently from other wide receivers. Last time we saw Ja'Marr Chase even take on that Pittsburgh Steelers defense, he scored twice on Joe Hayden of all cornerbacks in the National Football League. And with Joe Hayden potentially missing once again this week, and Minkah Fitzpatrick also missing, there's even more potential for Ja'Marr Chase to have himself a pop-off game. In comparison to a quarterback like Justin Herbert doesn't typically throw the ball deep. In comparison to early on in the season, Justin Herbert was throwing it deep every single game, maybe 2 to 3, 4 times per game. Just as of late, 1 to 2 times, max. And that's why, of course, they weren't able to take advantage of that secondary, even more than they possibly could have. I think Joe Burrow, not afraid of letting the ball rip. And I think Jamar Chase, being such a deep threat for this offense, is going to have himself a great game. Moving on to Stefon Diggs, number 6. Okay, so here's my kind of issue here. The number 1 wide receivers that play against this defense typically struggle. And it's not impossible to score against this defense. We've seen it. Okay, DK Metcalf takes 1 catch for 84 yards and a touchdown, makes his whole week. It's not impossible. But as of late, we've seen number 1 wide receivers, whether it be, of course, DK outside of that 1 reception. Mike Evans struggled a little bit here. Of course, this last week, DeVonta Smith practically disappeared. We've seen number 1 wide receivers against the New Orleans Saints disappear. And though they're giving up the 8th most points, I'm a little concerned. Though he's coming off of a week in which he had 4 catches, 2 of them in which were touchdowns against the Indianapolis Colts, there is a little bit of a concern. But luckily for Stefon Diggs, I mean, let's be honest, his career playing against the New Orleans Saints is unlike any other wide receiver versus a respective team. In the last 4 games that he's played against the New Orleans Saints, he's averaged 6 receptions, 92 yards, and a touchdown. If you're going to average those numbers, I think the bottom line is he's a talented wide receiver. If the opportunity is there, regardless of who's defending him and how well they've played against opposing wide receivers, Stefon Diggs is a different animal. And hopefully, he'll continue to ball out this upcoming week. Moving on, CeeDee Lamb's our number 7. Earlier today, I was given information that he did practice today. If that is going to be something that pertains to him potentially playing tomorrow in the Las Vegas Raiders versus Dallas Cowboys matchup, then by all means, I'm automatically starting him. Of course, he was in the concussion protocol, and the way that you pass and get out of that concussion protocol is the baseline test. Pretty much you're tested when you're full go, and then you're tested while you have a concussion. If you mess up that first test and just purposely into the game away, then technically you could get away with passing concussion protocol before. But nonetheless, if CeeDee Lamb is playing tomorrow, he's in my lineup. It's too easy of a matchup with Amari Cooper potentially out. I think CeeDee Lamb, the sky's the limit. We know this is a guy that got a concussion trying to catch the ball in the red zone. Dak Prescott's number 1 receiving option. Of course, we're firing him up as our number 7 this week, as long as he's healthy and playing. Moving on to our number 8, we have Chris Godwin of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Now, Chris Godwin's coming off of a 16.2 fantasy point performance against the New York Giants. Had a little bit of a 40-yard reception called back because of an offensive holding. Either way, Chris Godwin's playing against one of the easiest matchups at the position. Of course, giving up the 5th most points to opposing wide receivers. In fact, the Indianapolis Colts have given up 17 touchdowns to opposing wide receivers this season. Luckily for Chris Godwin, not only is he in a great matchup, but Antonio Brown looks like he's not going to play. And the reason why I wanted to mention that is because in the games in which Antonio Brown has missed this season, Chris Godwin has averaged 17.42 fantasy points per game, while on the opposite end of the spectrum, it's far less. Chris Godwin's a great play this week. And not only is he, his teammate Mike Evans is also a fantastic play this week for very similar reasons. Besides, again, the matchup's incredible, giving up the 5th most points to wide receivers. Let's talk about it. Stefon Diggs, 2 touchdowns. Of course, we saw Elijah Moore score 2 touchdowns against them. A.J. Brown, 155 and a touchdown. Deebo Samuel, 100 yards and a touchdown. Even Mike Evans, without AB in the lineup, has been significantly better. He's averaging 17.1 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format, coming off of a performance on Monday night in which he had 17.3 total fantasy points. Overall, of course, Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, 2 guys I'm firing up and finding a lot of success with this week. Moving on, Keenan Allen. Keenan Allen is absolutely unbelievable. Again, like I've mentioned, in the last couple weeks, he's truly been the number 1 option. Mike Williams has just vanished completely. And of course, the target counts, speak to that exactly. Again, from weeks 8 through 11, overall, Keenan Allen's been the number 6 wide receiver in fantasy football, averaging 15.65 fantasy points per game and 12 targets per game. As long as those numbers are going to continue to go in his direction, of course, he's going to find success. This week, he takes on the Denver Broncos. Last season, with Justin Herbert under center, of course, he was able to put up a 17.2 fantasy point performance in which he had 9 catches, 67 yards, and a touchdown against the Denver Broncos. I'm not too worried about the matchup. I think Keenan Allen's opportunity and his recent success speak volumes and is obviously going to keep him in our lineup for this week. Diontae Johnson, our number 11. A couple stats that I wanted to mention regarding Diontae Johnson. Though they play against the Cincinnati Bengals this week, Diontae Johnson didn't have the privilege of playing against them earlier this season. Of course, he was dealing with a knee injury in week 3 and did not participate. Now, here's the thing about him against the Cincinnati Bengals. He's found his fair share of success. Last season, 2020, against Cincinnati Bengals with Ben Roethlisberger under center, 6 catches, 116 yards and a touchdown, 20.6 fantasy points. I mean, is that really a surprise? Not really, because this season already with Big Ben under center, whenever Diontae Johnson's been given 10 or more targets per game, he's averaging about 15.55 fantasy points per game. That kind of opportunity leading to success is pretty much automatic. Of course, there's a reason why he had 7 catches, 101 receiving yards, and a touchdown against the Chargers. Really, honestly, strong secondary and 19.6 fantasy points. With opportunity comes success in the National Football League, especially with talented wide receiver options. Diontae Johnson against Cincinnati should be awesome this week. Moving on, DK Metcalf. I honestly just put this here out of the pure respect because it just seems crazy to me that DK Metcalf could go from scoring 16.6 and 19.3 fantasy points in 2 separate games with Geno Smith under center to going to a situation where with Russell Wilson back in the lineup, he's scoring 4.1 and 5.1 fantasy points. It just doesn't make sense to me. So, of course, when I look at this Washington football team matchup, giving up the 4th most points to wide receivers, seeing wide receivers like DJ Moore find success against them, it makes me think, well, it's only a matter of time until Russell Wilson gets back on track and, of course, DK Metcalf follows suit. Because if, in fact, we're going to see Russell Wilson throw for 50% passing completion percentage for the rest of the year, then, of course, everybody associated with him is going to suffer. But I think that's only a matter of time until it figures itself out. And, of course, DK Metcalf, along with Russell Wilson, get back on track this week. Moving on to the wide receiver 2 conversation. Speaking about getting back on track, Terry McLaurin kind of found himself once again this week. The thing that I want to mention to you guys, though he is at number 13 overall, is that he is a really volatile wide receiver. This season already, he has 4 games of over 100 receiving yards. One in which he's coming off of this last week, 103 receiving yards, 5 catches, 1 touchdown, 18.8 fantasy points. Outside of those 4 games in which he has 100 receiving yards, which in every single one of those games in which he has over 100 receiving yards this season, he has at least 1 receiving touchdown. Outside of that, every other performance is less than 10 fantasy points per week. And those kind of performances are unreliable and can legitimately destroy your week. And that is the entire conundrum that we have with Terry McLaurin. Is he going to succeed or is he going to fail? And though I think that the Seattle Seahawks matchup is one that he honestly could find himself a lot of success, there's a lot of sketchiness revolving around him. I think he's a fantastic player. If he's given the opportunity that he needs, of course he'll succeed every single week. It's just a matter of whether or not the quarterback, Taylor Heineke, can get the ball in his direction and get him on the right path. I think that'll be fine this week as our number 13. Moving on, Michael Pittman Jr. Again, Michael Pittman Jr. in the last 2 weeks, similar to Carson Wentz, has pretty much disappeared. Of course, the quarterback to wide receiver combination and the success of both of them are pretty much intertwined. There's a reason why Carson Wentz scoring 10 or less fantasy points each of the last 2 weeks have also transitioned to Michael Pittman Jr. not doing anything for the last 2 weeks. With that said, from weeks 5 through 9 of the 2021 fantasy football season, Michael Pittman Jr. was the number 3 overall wide receiver in fantasy. If you get back into a situation where they're heavily throwing the ball, specifically against Tampa Bay, who have been one of the best run-stopping defenses in the National Football League, and a defense that in their secondary has had a lot of injuries, then why not Michael Pittman Jr. have a step-up game here and find a lot of success as the receiving threat for this offense? Marquise Brown is our number 15. He technically practiced earlier today. I know he's dealing with a quad injury, but I want to go ahead and mention, if in fact Lamar Jackson is going to play and Marquise Brown is also going to play, success is going to be imminent, mainly because the last 2 times that Marquise Brown has played against the Cleveland Browns, he's found a lot of success. Had himself a 50-yard game in which he had a receiving touchdown as well last season, and a 101 receiving yard game. And in both those contests, he only had 6 targets in each of them. Now, to go back to the last 3 games of this season, 2021, he's had 39 targets in the last 3 games. When this man is getting 13 targets per game, based on the kind of receiver he is on top of that, the sky's the limit in terms of success. There's a reason why Marquise Brown has put up so many performances of over 10 fantasy points, over 15 fantasy points. With this guy being such a deep threat, a touchdown threat, and continuing to catch the eye of Lamar Jackson, I think Marquise Brown's a fantastic player as our number 15 this week. Moving on, we have DJ Moore. Like I mentioned, with Cam Newton under center, he's only going to get significantly better and better as the weeks progress. He was fantastic to start with Sam Darnold. Sam Darnold disappeared, and now that we have another stable quarterback under center, the red zone opportunities are only going to flourish because we know this is a deep threat wide receiver, and we know this is a guy that just needs the touchdown to get him over the edge every single week. So luckily, Cam Newton's going to make this offense significantly better, and of course, DJ Moore is going to feel that. With that being said, He takes on the Miami Dolphins, the second easiest matchup at the wide receiver position. The reason that is the second easiest matchup, besides the fact that Jamison Crowder scored last week, Elijah Moore had himself 8 catches, 141 and a touchdown. If Elijah Moore can score, then why not another Moore, DJ Moore, this upcoming week? Moving on. We have Adam Thielen as our number 17, taking on the 49ers defense. Again, Adam Thielen has been a wide receiver that, yes, he's going to get his targets, he's going to get his opportunity, but is he going to score a touchdown? And that's really been the biggest difference maker in his entire career. I mean, going to 2020, he scored 14 touchdowns in the 15 games that he played. This season already, this man has 8 receiving touchdowns. He's gotten back on track this last week, scoring a receiving touchdown against the Green Bay Packers. In fact, in 4 out of the last 5 games, Adam Thielen has scored a touchdown. If he continues to just accompany every performance he has with 6 extra points, of course he's going to be a relevant wide receiver. And as long as Kirk Cousins continues to send the ball in his direction and his Minnesota Vikings offense continues to elevate themselves to the next level, they're going to be in a fantastic position this upcoming week. Moving on to DeVonta Smith on number 18. DeVonta Smith taking on the New York Giants defense, giving up the 12th most points to opposing wide receivers. Now, DeVonta Smith, of course, was shut down this last week, only had himself 4 catches for 61 yards. But let's be honest, in the last couple weeks prior to that, the only difference in terms of his overall performances was touchdowns. Of course, the numbers in terms of catches, targets, they're very similar. It's all about scoring touchdowns for a wide receiver like this that needs to go to the next level. Well, luckily for him, he gets to take on the New York Giants defense, who, unfortunately for them, they've been giving up a lot of points to wide receivers. Besides Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, both going for over 16.5 fantasy points this last week, each scoring a touchdown. Tyreek Hill, 12 catches, 94 and a touchdown. Renfrow, 7 catches, 49 and a touchdown. Of course, DJ Moore, 6 catches, 73. Cooper Kupp earlier this year, 9 catches, 130 yards, 2 touchdowns against his defense. Though a lot of these wide receivers, like Kupp, like Renfrow, and Godwin, Tyreek Hill, predominantly play in the slot position, there have been times this season in which the overall snaps in the slot position for DeVonta Smith have spiked. Specifically, going back to the Los Angeles Chargers game, he played 40% of his offensive snaps from the slot position, and he was able to score in that game. If we get into a scenario in which DeVonta Smith takes his 10% per week and spikes it this week, that may be the recipe for success for the Philadelphia Eagles offense and Smith. Moving on, we have number 19, Darnell Mooney. Darnell Mooney is absolutely insane. He's had back-to-back weeks of over 19 fantasy points. Of course, in between those 2 games, he had himself a bye week, but nonetheless, going into this upcoming weekend's matchup against the Detroit Lions, you guys know I always say the Detroit Lions do not have a defense. They cannot stop a soul, whether it's on the ground or through the air. Doesn't matter. On top of that, Allen Robinson looks like he's going to be out once again this week. Continues to lead to potentially Darnell Mooney's upside. On top of it, Darnell Mooney had 16 targets last week. 16. I don't think there was another wide receiver last week that had more targets than Darnell Mooney. And though he was only able to catch the ball 5 times, was able to get himself 121 yards and a touchdown. The difference between Darnell Mooney and a lot of other wide receivers is he is a run after the catch receiver. He's pretty much like a Deebo Samuel. The reason why he scored last week, it was a bubble screen that went 50 yards for a touchdown. It wasn't, a beautiful pass from Andy Dalton. Sure, Andy Dalton had some nice passes on the sideline last week, but it wasn't like it was Andy Dalton's doing. It was all Mooney. Get the ball in this man's hands, and he's going to score. There's a reason why he had a rushing touchdown against the Pittsburgh Steelers a couple of weeks back. Get the ball in his hands, and he's going to score. Now, in my opinion, the most exciting factor for this Thursday's game between the Detroit Lions and Chicago Bears is the fact that, of course, Andy Dalton's going to be at the quarterback position. And why that is exciting for me? Well, when Andy Dalton came in, he targeted Darnell Mooney 11 times. I mean, the amount of just passing attempts he had, I think what he had, like 24 passing attempts, almost half of them went to Mooney. If that is going to continue to be the case with Allen Robinson once again missing, Darnell Mooney has an incredibly high upside this week. Moving on, we have Jaylen Waddle as our number 20. Speaking of being the favorite target of a quarterback, obviously Jaylen Waddle, a former teammate of Tua in college, is going to continue to see the most targets in this offense. And he's going to continue to have the opportunities that he does. Luckily, he scored himself a rushing touchdown, 1 rush for 16 yards, got himself into the end zone. Great, we'll take that. But 9 targets, 8 receptions, 65 yards. The baseline of production there, that 10 points, is probably going to be there every single week in great matchups. And though the Carolina Panthers have been a tougher defense, our only concern is whether or not, a guy like Stefon Gilmore is probably on him, covering him. Now, the thing about Stefon Gilmore is he hasn't played maximum snaps this season. And once he gets there, maybe it'll be a problem. But for right now, we're not too worried about it. And that's why we're firing up Jaylen Waddle. Moving on, Elijah Moore is our number 21, another rookie wide receiver that I wanted to mention again. From number 18 through 21, we have second-year and rookie wide receivers just filling up the list. Now, going into this week, of course, Elijah Moore has a great matchup against the Houston Texans, giving up the 9th most points to opposing wide receivers. He has to deal with the transition of going from Mike White to, of course, Josh Johnson to Joe Flacco to now Zach Wilson. But the thing that he has kept, pretty steady throughout all of that time with the changes at quarterback is his overall production. From week 8 through 11, he has been the number 2 overall wide receiver in fantasy football, averaging 17.9 fantasy points. That is an unbelievable number, and there's a reason why we wanted to pick him up off of the waivers a couple weeks back. They're spreading him around the formation. He's not just a slot receiver. He's lining up out wide everywhere. I mean, in the inline, doesn't matter. This guy is just everywhere, and he's making it look easy for a rookie wide receiver, which is crazy to me. Either way, it's a good matchup. You get the rookie quarterback back, and I think the combination of these two will lead to Elijah Moore's success this week. Moving on, Tyler Lockett's our number 22. Of course, Tyler Lockett, he's a sketchy play every week. He's got himself some volatility, similar to some of these other wide receivers, Terry McLaurin. But, I mean, the real thing about Tyler Lockett is that he only needs a couple grabs per game and he's good to go. He doesn't need the incredible opportunities some of these other guys. He's never going to require 12 targets per game to be relevant. He really just needs 5 or 6. And he can get himself a baseline value of 10 fantasy points with the upside of scoring a touchdown and getting to that 16 to 18 range. And that's pretty much it. And that's why he is a safer play. Because as long as Russell Wilson is under center, we know that there's a potential that Tyler Lockett could have himself a great game. They take on Washington. Again, it's the 4th easiest matchup at the position. There's a lot of potential success to be had here in this matchup. And I think Tyler Lockett, as long as Russell Wilson gets back on track, even if he doesn't, could still be a fantastic play this week at 22. Moving on to Mike Williams at number 23. Mike Williams had himself, I think, 4 catches for 40 yards until the very last play of their offensive drive, in which he caught himself a touchdown running down the sideline. Great, fantastic. But it really did take him, 55 of the 60-minute game to get there. If he doesn't score that touchdown, I don't know what we're thinking about Mike Williams. We're probably worried and not starting him this week. But at least he was able to find himself some success there. When they get down in the red zone and they're just continuing to feed the ball to Austin Eckler, it leads me to believe that Mike Williams may not be as vital of an option in this, red zone attack as we first once saw earlier this season. If that's going to continue to be the case, it could be a sketchier player, but that's why we have him at 23, because we know that there's a lot of inherent risk with a wide receiver like Mike Williams. Moving on to A.J. Brown. Again, he's dealing with an injury. He's coming off of 3 consecutive terrible games, and he's probably going to be the only healthy option. I don't even know if he's going to be healthy. That's actually a thing. He might be the only option on that team, healthy or not, that is going to pull attention from Bill Belichick. Because who else is Bill Belichick going to try to stop? Golden Tate? I mean, is that what we're doing? Nick Westbrook-Ikini, is he going to pull the pressure? No. It's going to be Bill Belichick shutting down A.J. Brown. And if and when he does, A.J. Brown's going to have a tough slate. And that is why I have him at 24. Approach with very much so caution, because I don't know what's going to happen besides perhaps him not even playing or a shutdown game. We'll see. Moving on. Our wide receiver 3 conversation begins with Brandin Cooks. Again, if players like CeeDee Lamb, A.J. Brown, maybe somebody else pops up on the injury report, Marquise Brown, and they end up missing, well, of course, a player like Brandin Cooks at number 25 would significantly move up and get into that top 24 conversation because, again, I think he has the ability to get into that top 15 conversation every single week. It's just a matter of whether or not the quarterback position, specifically Tyrod Taylor, is going to help him get there. Coming off of a week in which he only had 2 catches for 18 yards, it is worrisome considering his recent performances as of late haven't been great. But luckily, he plays against the Jets, the 13th easiest matchup at the position. Recently, Mac Hollins, 72 yards and a touchdown. Diggs, 8 catches, 162 and a touchdown. Of course, in that same game, Gabriel Davis went for over 100 yards. Pittman, 64 and a touchdown. As of the last 4 games, the New York Jets defense have allowed 6 touchdowns to opposing wide receivers. There's a lot of success to potentially be had. Brandin Cooks should be a play. Moving on to Michael Gallup. If, in fact, CeeDee Lamb is going to miss time, I think Michael Gallup is very easily a top 18 wide receiver. Considering, in fact, besides Amari Cooper being out last week, in the second half of that game, CeeDee Lamb was missing, and there's a reason why Michael Gallup had a total of 10 targets. If this man is going to be given double-digit opportunity, whether or not CeeDee Lamb is on the field or not, then of course he's going to have incredible value. We have him at 26 for now until otherwise noted. Again, if in fact CeeDee Lamb's missing, he'd be a top 18 wide receiver in my opinion because, again, the opportunity is going to be there. And in a Dak Prescott-led offense, the number 1 wide receiver is certainly going to ball out. Moving on, Jerry Jeudy's our number 27. Again, the Los Angeles Chargers defense, they had a bit of a trouble with Big Ben Roethlisberger there. Of course, Diontae Johnson had himself a great game of over 100 receiving yards. Claypool almost got there, had himself 93 receiving yards. If in fact this offense is going to go ahead and try to air it out against the Los Angeles Chargers, I think Jerry Jeudy's probably the guy that they're going to go to. In the last 2 games that they played, of course, Jerry Jeudy had 17 total targets. He's played majority of his snaps in the slot position and could very easily expose Chris Harris Jr., who in the last couple weeks has had himself some troubles there. I think Jerry Jeudy's not a bad option. The only worry that potentially comes to my mind is, can we really trust the Denver Broncos receiving options or even options as an offense? Really, it's been Melvin Gordon and maybe a touchdown, stealing touchdowns every other week. The wide receiver position hasn't been able to kind of have themselves their day. Hopefully this week, Jerry Jeudy can have himself a breakout performance here. Moving on to Hunter Renfrow, our number 28, taking on the Dallas Cowboys defense. Again, when I look at this receiving core outside of Darren Waller, I mean, Renfrow is the only other option. Every other week, maybe Bryan Edwards disappears. Deshaun Jackson's, complained about being on the Rams because he wasn't getting enough touches. He touched the ball like 1 time this last week for the Raiders. It's Renfrow or bust in terms of having a receiving option for the Raiders offense. We all know that, of course, Derek Carr loves to throw it in his direction. He's had a lot of red zone upside this season, and hopefully, if he's able to find the end zone, could be an incredible play. Outside of that, we're going to have to rely upon a lot of those receptions getting a great amount of yards. Moving on, we have Chase Claypool at number 29, coming off a great game, like I mentioned a little bit earlier with Jerry Jeudy. When he played against the Los Angeles Chargers last week, I didn't expect him to have that good of a game, but Big Ben really did step up and help Chase Claypool get to that, over 10 fantasy point level. And that's pretty much where I see him at. He certainly has, upside, but typically he's probably going to be like 4 or 5 catches, 70 yards every week. And if we can survive with that until he scores a touchdown, then by all means, that is why I have him at number 29, because that is the baseline of production we expect and hopefully we'll end up seeing from him. Moving on to 30, Brandin Aiyuk. Now, Brandin Aiyuk had a great game. 18 fantasy points, 7 catches on 7 targets, 85 yards and a touchdown. That's incredible. But let's kind of put it into account. Unfortunately, last week, Deebo Samuel only had 2 targets, 1 catch. If, in fact, we're going to see a scenario going into this upcoming week's matchup against the Minnesota Vikings in which Deebo Samuel is once again getting all the targets back in his direction, then perhaps Brandin Aiyuk disappears. And if that's going to be the case, that could be very detrimental to many of our fantasy teams if we trust him at a higher capacity. I like it at number 30, mainly because it is the Minnesota Vikings matchup. They're giving up the 3rd most points to wide receivers. Davante Adams and Marquise Valdes-Scantling were both able to find a lot of success against them. Even, Josiah DeGuara was able to score a touchdown. I think this secondary for the Minnesota Vikings for the last 2 seasons has been horrid and certainly can be taken advantage of. It's just a matter of how much can we trust Brandin Aiyuk or potentially how much can we trust Kyle Shanahan. Moving on, Jarvis Landry is at number 31. Luckily, Jarvis Landry was able to find the end zone with a rushing touchdown. Ran himself in on a broken play in which he was supposed to actually pass the ball. Outside of that, this man only catches the ball, 4 times for 26 yards and is a terrible play last week. I think if Baker Mayfield is the starting quarterback this week, I don't want to touch Jarvis Landry. If it is, in fact, Case Keenum, I may want to go ahead and play him at this number 31 spot, but that's my only contingency. If Baker Mayfield's at the quarterback position, I don't know if I can trust any receiving options in this offense, so I would just basically only be playing either an Austin Hooper, Nick Chubb, and Kareem Hunt, and that is all. Moving on, we have Corey Davis as our number 32. Now, again, Corey Davis, it's just a matter of whether or not Zach Wilson and him are going to click immediately. It's a great matchup against Houston. And earlier this season, when Zach Wilson and Corey Davis have been in the same game, we've seen multiple games in which he's either scoring 2 touchdowns or getting over 100 receiving yards. It's just a matter, again, is Zach Wilson ready to get back to action and at least feed the ball in the direction of Corey Davis? With Elijah Moore being such a huge presence in this offense, and of course, Jamison Crowder being active there, without much of a running game, I think this may be a game in which they're airing it out heavily and getting Corey Davis involved. Moving on to T. Higgins. Man, I don't know why I trusted T. Higgins last week. I had a feeling that he was going to completely disappear, but I didn't trust my instinct. I went, you know what? Joe Burrow likes to air it out. Joe Burrow didn't do anything last week. And when I look at the Pittsburgh Steelers matchup this week, I think to myself, well, of course they're going to run the ball. Tyler Boyd's stealing, targets every single week. Jamar Chase is always going to get his. Uzama's, going to continue to be there. But like I mentioned last week, T. Higgins, in terms of scoring a touchdown, is like the number 4 or 5 option on this team. Besides Mixon, Chase, Uzama, maybe even Boyd higher than him, or even Burrow running it in may be a higher option. I think Higgins playing that backseat role in this offense is super sketchy. And that's why we have him in 33, because if you're not able to go ahead and immediately get touchdown upside every single week, then the yardage may not be able to carry us to success. Moving on to Courtland Sutton. Speaking of someone that hasn't been given much opportunity as of late, Courtland Sutton's fine. He's a good wide receiver. He just signed a major deal in this offense. He's found a lot of success in the past against the Los Angeles Chargers defense. This is fantastic. These things continue to stack up for him. But with Teddy Bridgewater, as of late, when Jerry Jeudy's come back, man, the guy has not gotten enough targets. Tim Patrick has been the most consistent wide receiver option on this offense this season, or perhaps for the last couple of years here. I think Courtland Sutton's decent, but again, he needs to score a touchdown. That's pretty much what these guys are at the back end here. Sure, he can come out, have a game in which he catches the ball 5 times for 75 yards, but if he's not able to go ahead and take it beyond that, 34 is his best upside. Moving on to 35, Rashod Bateman. If Lamar Jackson's playing and Marquise Brown is out, Rashod Bateman's an even better play, but I do anticipate Marquise Brown to play. And with that, Rashod Bateman kind of goes back to being like a 10-point overall wide receiver. With upside, sure, but certainly not as much because Marquise Brown, Mark Ingram, Lamar Jackson, and Freeman are higher options in terms of priority down in the red zone. Moving on to our last option. Once, in fact, I do get a higher resolution image of Odell Beckham Jr., not in practice squad gear, and in an actual uniform for the Los Angeles Rams, we'll replace that. But until then, Odell Beckham Jr. against Green Bay, I think he'll have, 2 extra weeks under his belt in terms of learning this offense, and now will be completely utilized by Matthew Stafford. I think we're going to see a lot of success this week. As to how much, we're going to have to wait and see what kind of snap counts we're looking at. I'm not on the train of completely starting him blindly, but I want to, kind of throw it out there. If he is the best wide receiver 3 option you have, or flex option, perhaps we're firing him up. Either way, these are my top 36 wide receiver rankings for week 12 of the 2021 fantasy football season. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Happy Thanksgiving. Tomorrow morning we'll be, of course, live streaming 7:30 a.m. to 9:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Kickoff with Kirchhoff. Of course, we'll have a live stream later on in the week on Sunday morning as well. Don't worry about that. That will stay consistent. I'll give you guys more information regarding that as we continue throughout the week. Hope you enjoyed the content. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate you guys. As always, have a wonderful holiday weekend. And until next time, guys, I'll see you. Peace.